Hello, will you please join me in your scriptures? Please open up the Book of Mormon to Jacob chapter 5. Every now and then, I want to help you prepare for a tough lesson. I don't do this often, but this content mastery can be really important. My hope is that you can get a couple of ideas about how to do a difficult block of scripture well. I notice in the curriculum, it gives you 2 days to cover Jacob 5 and 6. I'm just treating Jacob 5 today, however you want to look at that. One of the skills in treating so many verses in such a short amount of time is really knowing what to read and what not to read. Are there parts where you can have students skimming for information just to glean that quickly? We want to select the information just to get to the principles that have been selected. Secondly, notice that oftentimes I'm going to use search for information questions. There is a right answer to these questions. They're not super deep. The answer is staring the student in the face if they have their scriptures open. I have chosen to look at those principles that will apply personally to my students, as opposed to a take of this chapter as a global historical overview of the scattering and gathering of Israel. I want them to see that, but I want to emphasize the personal application here. That's just how I've approached it. Watch for these 6 principles as the lesson unfolds. More on that later. So every time we come to one of those principles, that would be an opportunity in your class to really pause, slow down, and complete that learning pattern of understanding the principle, feeling the truth and importance and urgency of the principle, and applying the principle to their lives. I may do some of that, and others I may not do. Let's go in Jacob 5. Look at the chapter heading of Jacob chapter 5. Who is Jacob quoting? Yeah, Zenos. That is a prophet that was found in the brass plates, not found in our Old Testament. But Jacob wants you to know all the credit of the words of this chapter are to Zenos. And it says also that this is going to be an allegory. That's a long, drawn-out parable. So think about the Savior's parable, just 70 whatever verses long. And in the first couple of verses, there's a main object of the parable or the allegory. The main character is actually a plant. Let's read about that in verse 2 through 6. As you read, will you just mark the description of the original state of this plant? Verse 2, Hearken, O ye house of Israel, and hear the words of me, a prophet of the Lord. For behold, thus saith the Lord, I will liken thee, O house of Israel, unto a tame olive tree, which a man took and nourished in his vineyard, and it grew and waxed old and began to decay. And it came to pass that the master of the vineyard went forth, and he saw that his olive tree began to decay, and he said, I will prune it, and dig about it, and nourish it, that perhaps it may shoot forth young and tender branches, that it perisheth not. And it came to pass that he pruned it, and digged about it, and nourished it according to his word. And it came to pass after many days, it began to put forth somewhat a little young and tender branches, but behold, the main top thereof began to perish. What is the main character, the main object of this allegory? That's right, it's a tame olive tree. And I think tame means that it had been cultivated to grow fruit that was good to eat. How is it doing when we enter the scene? In verse 3, yeah, it's looking pretty bad. It had grown up, but now it's old and decaying. What does he do to try to help his tree? Yeah, that was verse 4. He prunes it. Let's talk about that. What is pruning? He digs about it. Why would you dig around a tree? What good is that? And he nourishes it. We will hear later about dunging, and you might spend a second explaining that to your students. So they do that. How long went by? Verse 6, many days go by. And what was the result? Also verse 6, I'm answering these questions that your students should be answering, right? And you can point them to the verses. Yeah, there is a little bit of growth on that tree, but the top of it is not very good. Okay, so maybe we draw that on the board and some of the problems. The tree was likened unto what? In verse 3. the house of Israel. We could even write that down as well. This begins a series of helps that the Lord of the Vineyard wants to do to help his trees out and how he's going to do it. So their plan is to take those branches that are doing good and graft them into other parts of the vineyard. You might draw a representation of grafting or assure that your students understand what it means to graft. And so we're going to look at 3 samples of how they're doing. So you have the original tree plus 3 samples throughout the vineyard. Let's go to verse 15. They do that, and how long goes by? This is just a skim. Yeah, a long time went by. Look at verse 17. When they check up on the original tree, how's it doing? Will somebody read verse 17? And it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard looked and beheld the tree in which the wild olive branches had been grafted in. And it sprung forth and begun to bear fruit. And he beheld that it was good, and the fruit thereof was like unto the natural fruit. Because of the wild branches that were grafted in, the original tree is actually doing good, with good fruit. So maybe we designate that with a plus sign. Verse 20, as they go around the vineyard, here's the first sample. Now this was one that had some of the original branches that were doing good, and we sent it across to some random tree. Verse 20, skim, how is its fruit? Yeah, right in the middle of that verse. The fruit of that one is good. Let's mark that. Verse 21 talks about the ground. Would somebody read 21? And it came to pass that the servant said unto his master, How comest thou hither to plant this tree, or the branch of this tree? For behold, it was the poorest spot of land in all the vineyard. And let's just write that down. It's a very poor ground. Verse 22, how come it's okay that the ground was poor for this first sample? Yeah, the Lord is going to take care of it. He knows that it's going to be okay. Okay, let's look at the second sample. Go on to verse 23, another branch. First of all, what do you notice about the ground in verse 23? Yeah, they were wrong. They thought that it was the first sample was the poorest ground, but actually the second ground is worse than the first, and he's also taken care of it. How is the fruit? Yeah, the fruit looks good. Verse 24, there's another branch. And the reason why I've only drawn and talked about 3 is because here it looks like there's 4 samples. Later it looks like there's only 3. Anyway, in verse 24, the next 2 second and third samples, they're good. Verse 25, final sample. How's the ground? It's a good spot of ground. And how is the fruit? Part of it is good, part of it is bad. Here's where we go to our first principle. What are we learning about ground? How is that related to the success of the fruit? There is no correlation between the ground that they are planted in and how the fruit actually turns out. What might that be like in life? You can talk about people maybe who grow up in bad situations. Maybe a student will talk about how it really doesn't matter what neighborhood you grow up in. There are other factors that matter a lot more. The cultivating, the care, matter more than just where you happen to be planted. Okay, so moving on. The master wants to just take off the bad part of that last sample. The servant begs him to hold on, so they go back to work trying to cultivate. Look at verse 29. How long do they try that? Yeah, a long time. Look at some other phrases in verse 29 about the timetable. What phrases stand out? Says the time draws near and the end soon comes. If this were the history of the world, what year do you think we're in verse 29? Some students might say 1830s or the Restoration or now. I'm good with any of that. And that's maybe this idea that we're engaged in this work. That was the second principle. In this second checkup now, look at verse 32. How is the original house of Israel tree? None of the fruit is good. Verse 35, let's look at this tree's success in verse 35. Would somebody read that? It came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard said unto his servant, the tree profiteth me nothing, and the roots thereof profit me nothing, so long as it shall bring forth evil fruit. In one way, this master seems kind of impatient. On the other hand, he keeps saying, it grieveth me, and he's worked so hard. But the success of a tree in this vineyard is measured by the quality of its fruit. If that tree is like us, the success of a child of God on earth is measured by what? How might you fill in that blank? So it's not that the Lord is impatient or doesn't value the tree. We're not talking about worth, but the success really is tied to certain things that the Lord hopes will happen in the lives of his children. That was another principle. Well, there's the tree. Let's look at the other samples after all of this work. So verse 39, the first, second, and last, and that's the part. There's just 3 samples there instead of the original 4 that we seemed to have earlier, but it's all bad in verse 39. So we put a negative for all of those checkups. Let's read verse 47. As he's looking at his whole vineyard now has bad fruit, here's what he says. Will somebody read 47? But what could I have done more in my vineyard? Have I slackened my hand that I have not nourished it? Nay, I have nourished it, and I have digged about, and I have pruned it, and I have dunged it, and I have stretched forth my hand almost all the day long. And the end draweth nigh, and it grieveth me that I should hew down all the trees of my vineyard, and cast them into the fire, that they should be burned. Who is it that has corrupted my vineyard? There's some rhetorical questions there, and I think they're worth addressing with your students. What more could he have done? What are we learning about the Lord? Yeah, he's done everything he can do. In fact, the principle, there seems to be no end to the lengths the Lord will go to nourish, help, and support our growth. And maybe this is an opportunity to pause and say, how has the Lord nourished and blessed and helped his church, helped your family, helped you in your life? There could be some meaningful conversation from that. What about this other rhetorical question at the end? Who is it that has corrupted my vineyard? Some students might point to Satan immediately. It's easy to blame him, but we had no show of some kind of enemy going around hurting things. Another answer might be, it's the tree itself. It's the tree itself. And I think that the Lord had a parable about that. That's getting into other things. Let's go to verse 48. I think there is a lesson here. Now, there's a servant standing next to him as he asks those questions. Would somebody read 48? And it came to pass that the servant said unto his master, Is it not the loftiness of thy vineyard? Have not the branches thereof overcome the roots which are good? And because the branches have overcome the roots thereof, behold, they grew faster than the strength of the roots, taking strength unto themselves. Behold, I say, is not this the cause that the trees of thy vineyard have become corrupted? So the servant thinks that it's top heavy. There's too many branches, that the roots couldn't strengthen all of those branches in the life of the tree. If that tree is us, what are some of those branches that maybe we should have just lobbed off? So the principle that I'm trying to help my students understand is we must avoid becoming encumbered about and giving strength to things that don't matter. Another way to look at that principle would just be to ask, what are some branches that the church has recently pruned off of its tree to bring more strength to the remaining branches? So you could look at scouting or different kinds of youth programs, names of the Young Women's Organization, that third hour of church. We're in a season of pruning in the church. And the hope is the remaining branches have more attention of the roots. So if the roots, maybe you could ask, what are the roots in your life? What are the roots in the church? They're the things that never change. They're essential to bring us strength. They are the power of the Holy Ghost, ordinances and covenants. Maybe the trunk is like those principles and doctrines, firm and unchanging. But those branches, they change by season. They grow leaves, they fall. Sometimes fruit grows, sometimes it doesn't. It sways in the wind. The branches are fleeting and not necessary to be permanent parts of the trunk and the roots. So it's okay if we prune those off, and maybe that would be a conversation you could ask about. Okay, let's go to verse 58. Listen to the plea of the Lord of the vineyard. Could somebody read starting in 58 through 62? Listen for how the Lord feels about his vineyard again. Maybe half of your students look for why he wants to save it, half of the students on how. And we will nourish again the trees of the vineyard. We'll trim up the branches thereof, and we will pluck from the trees those branches which are ripened that must perish, and cast them into the fire. And this I do, that perhaps the roots thereof may take strength because of their goodness, and because of the change of the branches, that they may overcome the evil. Sometimes there's just power in changing the branches. And because that I have preserved the natural branches and the roots thereof, that I have grafted in the natural branches again into their mother tree. That's the plan on this last one. Take back those branches and put them in their mother tree. That perhaps the trees of my vineyard may bring forth again good fruit, and that I may have joy again in the fruit of my vineyard, and perhaps that I may rejoice exceedingly that I have preserved the roots and the branches of the first fruit. Wherefore, go to, and call servants, that we may labor diligently with our might in the vineyard, that we may prepare the way, that I may bring forth again the natural fruit, which natural fruit is good and the most precious above all other fruit. Wherefore, let us go and labor with our might this last time, for behold, the end draweth nigh, and this is for the last time that I shall prune my vineyard. And then just take their thoughts. Why does the Lord want to save it? And how will he save it in those verses? In verse 63, I've marked them in purple. A lot more verbs that they go and they work and they do. And you could maybe have them just skim and shout out these verbs. Graft, dig, nourish, dig, prune, dung, prepare, clear away. And it continues in 66, right? Clear away. Cast into the fire, sweep away, graft in again, graft, bring them in, cast away, prune. They're going at it at work. Look at verse 70. For the first time, we have multiple servants. How many servants show up? There were few. Why do you think only a few showed up? Maybe talk about called and chosen, or about how Nephi saw that the Lord's kingdom would be all over the earth, but few, relatively few in numbers, or just the distractions of the world. When they check on it the third and final time, how is it? Let's look at verse 75. It came to pass that when the Lord of the vineyard saw that his fruit was good, and that his vineyard was no more corrupt, he called up his servants and said to them, Behold, for the last time we have nourished my vineyard, and thou beholdest that I have done according to my will, and I have preserved the natural fruit, that it is good, even like as it was in the beginning. All of it's good. Olive, that's a pun, you could use olive. And blessed art thou, for because thou hast been diligent in laboring with me in my vineyard, and have kept my commandments, and have brought again unto me the natural fruit, that my vineyard is no more corrupted, and the bad is cast away, behold, ye shall have joy with me because of the fruit of my vineyard. What's in it for the laborers? And that was the last point. There is joy in being a servant of the Lord. At the end, I might just ask my students, what have you seen that hasn't been said yet? What else are we learning? And of course, you'll want to follow the Spirit to take lots of opportunities to talk and discuss throughout. But there's just kind of a quick overview of how I might summarize and help students. I hope you have a great lesson in Jacob 5. And I hope that you will insert your own personality and things that you noticed that should be brought up. And thank you so much for all that you do. Hope it was helpful. Bye.